Well, I think it's a mindset shift. We need to get people thinking, I can invest. And honestly, it's nobody's fault, because a lot of the myths that are out there, they did used to be true. And we're placing all this burden on charities to solve all the world's problems: climate change, healthcare, cure diseases, all of those things. What are we doing with that? There's so much other innovation that's happening. We're not putting our dollars towards that. How do we get more people who are underrepresented, women, people of color, disabled people? How do we get those founders more funding? We get the people that look like them writing the checks and sitting at the table too, right?
And I think these conversations, exposure to other, whether it's early stage or growth stage businesses and investors, what it does is just expand what you're exposed to, which will strengthen your own business. Thank you so much for joining me, Marcia. Looking forward to exploring some of the angles that not everyone who would be used to engaging with my content has necessarily started to think about yet, as our role as investors. So looking forward to picking your brains today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So we've framed the conversation today around investing in change. And if investing has felt disconnected or impersonal, or something that's kind of out of reach, not really part of your thinking process or your day-to-day decisions, then this is going to be a good conversation to hopefully plant a few seeds and spark some ideas as to how you can engage in a different way. Give us a little bit of background to your introduction and growing love of this place of investment, and how we can use that to bring more of the fullness of who we are into the world. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah. So in 2012, I was invited to an angel investing meeting. My husband came home one day, told me we were invited to this meeting, and I was like, okay, cool. What's that? What is angel investing? I had absolutely no idea. I thought maybe it was people got together, picked stocks. I didn't know. Come to find out that I was living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at the time, that there are entrepreneurs working on every kind of invention and innovation that you can think of, all over the world, in every city, in every town. And I was just so fascinated. I had been working in a corporate job, and I thought to myself, where have I been? I felt like I was living under a rock. Where have I been that all these people are working on these really cool things? I've been in my corporate job kind of doing the same thing and not really knowing all of these really cool things that were happening outside. So I thought, wow, this is interesting. But I don't have a finance degree, and I'm not uber rich or anything like that. So how could this be for me? I'm just your average kind of Joe person. So come to find out that there are a lot of myths out there around investing. People think it's for the rich, it's for the well-connected. You have to have a finance degree, you have to know all these things, you have to be educated in all of this stuff before you can actually get involved. But entrepreneurs are working on all kinds of different and innovative things, and they need help in all kinds of ways. Of course, every entrepreneur is always looking for money, but they also need help with expertise, networks, opening doors to different places, maybe getting into a store if they had a product they were trying to sell. So there's lots and lots of things that entrepreneurs need, even beyond money. But we don't really talk about that. So as I started to learn more about this space, and I started to learn, wait a minute, women only get 3% of the funding that's out there, and men are getting 97%. I'm sorry, women are 50% of the population. So I think they probably have more than 3% of the good ideas. So how do we change this? And as I learned more and more about it, I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many things that people could do to help encourage this innovation. And in the US anyway, we have a lot of charitable organizations. There are charitable organizations all over the world. But in the US, our annual amount of charitable giving is about $475 billion, which is a lot of money. But that is equivalent to only about 1% of the value of the US stock market. So if you think about how much money is actually going towards charities, and we're placing all this burden on charities to solve all the world's problems: climate change, healthcare, cure diseases, all of those things. What are we doing with, there's so much other innovation that's happening. We're not putting our dollars towards that. And so I would start to talk to people and they would say, oh, I don't know that that can be for me. And I would think it can be. And I was starting to make investments, but I was quickly running out of money because you're only supposed to be using like a small pit, you know, kind
Yeah,
of have
it's
everything in
speculative. Yeah.
buckets.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought, well, no, wait a minute. There has to be like more to this. Like other people could do this too. And so that's when I kind of went on a mission to say, hey, okay, let's get more people to know about this. Cause I think at the end of the day, we just have an awareness problem.
And
Yeah.
some of this is first just even knowing that it exists. So you said you felt like you'd been living under a rock, like, oh,
Yeah.
all this stuff's going on. And as people start to engage in this conversation, I think making that connection of, yes, there's the comparison you made of the charity dollars versus the stock exchange. But then when we come into the space that I'm really passionate about of small and medium-sized businesses that are in that privately owned aspect, when we're leading these types of organizations, we actually have massive amounts to give far beyond investment opportunity, which, as you said, is yes, there's the capital requirement, which we can talk about today. But these businesses need the exact kind of experience that we all have having run businesses for decades. There is a much closer and stronger connection, I think, for business leaders to start to think of themselves as investors and tap into this conversation. And I really like that entry point around the angel investment piece and trying to see how you could play in that area. You talked about, one of the things that shocked you, that 3% of capital going to women-owned or run businesses. What are some of the other big kind of aha moments where you went, oh, I want to have a role in changing that? What else have you seen that has surprised you?
Well, I think there are just so many amazing people who have small businesses. So I guess what was surprising to me is what's the difference between a small business that's investable and a small business that is kind of I guess they call it like Main Street or like a mom and pop type of thing. And I'm just so fascinated at all of the different ways that businesses can get funding. And nowadays, there are a lot more options for small businesses. So in the US, we have this US Securities and Exchange Commission. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to sit on an advisory committee for the commission and called Small Business Capital Formation. And we are all about trying to get capital to small businesses, not just startups. There's a lot of people on the committee. There's about 20 of us. And we try to represent every type of business, every type of entrepreneur, every race, color, everything, and gender. And what we're trying to do is make sure that everyone has an equal voice. So I kind of represent like the angel side. But like with startups are scalable. So we want to see that if we make an investment and we put in $10, that we're going to be able to walk out with at least $100 from the investment that we put in. It's kind of like a 10x rule around angel investing. So if you have a type of business that's like your coffee shop down the street or a dry cleaner, that's not really a scalable business. I mean, it could be if you had a certain business model and you were going to scale it across country or whatever, become Starbucks. That's one thing. But most of the time, a scalable business is like a tech company or some kind of healthcare or something like that. So what ends up happening is, those types of businesses are what angel investors look for. But there's this whole group of other businesses that really need capital and they need support too. And so how can we get money to them? And I've actually seen, especially in the last 5 years, more and more creative ways to use loans and actually being able to use crowdfunding toward a debt product as opposed to an equity product. And I think stuff like that is really super fascinating. And I love seeing that because to me, what we're starting to do, it's on a very small scale, but what we're starting to do is democratize this whole private market thing and be able to see entrepreneurs of any kind in whatever type of business they want to do really be able to thrive.
Yeah. I agree. We've been 2 and a bit decades now trying to have lots of those conversations around the democratizing aspect, because I think a lot of the views, and you touched on this with some of those common challenges people raise, a lot of the views people have about investment are just dated. So they were true a few decades ago, but there has been all of this change. And so there's been a comment made to someone, 15, 20 years ago about what they could and couldn't do. And that just has stayed as their reality. But as you said, we've invested as shareholders and then on the platform as well, and a platform many years ago here that does the exact piece you just spoke about, that does at that retail investor level debt into small businesses. And when people start to realize, still most people don't realize they can do these things. So people have heard about crowdfunding, but they still think of it as, you know, a smaller scale piece or pre-buying something, that there's still limits to how we're understanding what these different tools are. And so I really love the fact that you've kind of committed yourself and put that effort and time into a number of projects now, including your book, including a recent film that's done very well all over the place, to really do some of this education component. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk us through some of those elements of how we actually can start to become and think of ourselves as an active investor in a few different ways. Like, what can that path look like? What are our options?
Yes. And you know what? I think that you said it, you just summed it up so perfectly. It's the ability to think of ourselves as investors. You know, a lot of times I'll talk to men, and I'm actually a huge fan of men. Okay, first of all, let's just say they're great investors. They really, and there are a lot of men out there that are really trying to help female founders, which is great. I'm also just trying to get women to actually be thinking that they are capable, they are able, they should be sitting at the table making those investment decisions too, right? So how do we get more people who are underrepresented, women, people of color, disabled people? How do we get those founders more funding? We get the people that look like them writing the checks and sitting at the table too.
Exactly.
Right? Well, I think it's a mindset shift. We need to like get people thinking, I can invest. And honestly, it's nobody's fault, because a lot of the myths that are out there, they did used to be true. Like even in the 80s, you know, trying to buy a share of a public stock was very cumbersome. There were a lot of fees. You had to have a special brokerage account. You really did have to be rich. Okay. And nowadays you can go on to a platform like Robinhood or E-Trade or whatever, and you could buy a fraction of a share of a stock for $10. And if you didn't want to keep it, you could literally turn around and sell it the next 5 minutes. You know, it's like super easy, right? Even when I started as an angel investor, if you wanted to invest in a fund, which I never did at first because it was so onerous to do it. You had to have like $250,000 or even $1 million just to be able to do that. It was so crazy. So, but nowadays, angel groups and other small funds have started to make it so much simpler, and you can invest with much, much, much lower dollar amounts, even 1,000. I was talking to somebody today who has a fund, and her minimum investment is 5,000, and then they invest in multiple companies so that you get exposure to multiple companies. And I thought, wow, that's just so different. You know, 5,000 versus 250,000. You know, it's such a immense difference. But even for people who don't have a lot of money, nowadays you can start with equity crowdfunding, and you can invest as little as $50. And so I figure if there are people out there that want to try this and they don't want to put a lot of capital at risk, that's totally fine. And they want to learn about it. There's a way to do that through these platforms that can be really, really educational. You don't even have to invest. You can go out and look at these platforms, and you could like I have an exercise in my workbook. We'll talk about my book in a minute, but I wrote a workbook that goes with it. And one of the exercises is to create a mock portfolio on an equity crowdfunding site, and that doesn't cost anything. You could literally, it's like almost like Monopoly, you know, you just play the game and you make
just to get your head around it.
Get your head around it. Because I think that's some of the biggest problems is people, they think, oh my gosh, this looks so daunting. Like, I just feel like I would have to know everything, especially as women. You know, we want to know everything. We want to learn everything. We want to feel like we're perfectly informed before we can make a final decision. So I just always think if there's a way that we can take that anxiety of like feeling like it's so daunting away, it would make it easier.
I think too, there's been historically not everyone has done this intentionally, but there has been power dynamics at play that have purposely made things more confusing than they need to be, used language to exclude, kind of overcomplicated these things to try to keep them exclusive. And what is amazing shift that has been occurring over the last decade or so is so many more people actively doing the education piece and the removing those barriers, helping people understand. What would be the way that you would describe to us your book and how you've tried to make accessible and explain so that more people could engage?
I wrote the book out of pure frustration, I think. I would talk to people that I would meet, just in life, either through my stepkids, baseball, or whatever. And I would meet people and I would say, they would learn about what I was doing and that I was helping some entrepreneurs. And they would, every time I would see them, they would say, "Oh, tell me more about like what entrepreneurs did you meet this week?" and that type of thing. And I would tell them and I'd say, you know what, you can be involved in this too. I mean, you could help, in some level or whatever way you'd want to. And they would say, "Oh no," and then back to the myths. You have to be rich. I don't have finance. Like I would go on and on. I kept keeping the same thing. So I was like, you know what? I have run out of money personally. So I had to put myself on an investing diet. And I just said, I can't personally write any more checks. So how can I start to get this message out there? Well, I was lucky enough between 2010 and 2020 to live. Well, I don't know how many people would think it was lucky, but I lived in 5 different cities in the US, which was a lot of moving around. I get it.
Yeah.
But because of my husband's job, we lived in a couple of different places. And I got to see what it was like for entrepreneurs and investors in those different places. And in some places, I did live in Silicon Valley. I did live in New York. So that was interesting. Lots of money flowing, lots of things happening. But I also lived in Pittsburgh and Charlotte and Dallas, which they don't come to the top of your mind as like an entrepreneurial hub. But there's so much going on in all of those places, but everything is a little bit different. So I felt like I had tried so many different things and I made a whole bunch of mistakes. So I thought, why don't I write a book? And it would be like the book I wish I'd had. I wish somebody would have told me all these things before I started investing. And then I could have like maybe, saved myself some time, definitely time, and probably some money too. But it would have been like kind of the path. Like maybe if somebody would have sat me down and said, "Hey, you think about these things, like don't invest in the first company you see." What did I do? "Oh, look, there's like that entrepreneur. I love them so much, And then I would like, "Oh, I want to invest, because they're so wonderful." Because every entrepreneur you meet, you think is wonderful. Because seriously, so many entrepreneurs out there doing so many amazing things, and you just can't help yourself. Like literally, you just can't. I talk to angel investors all the time, and they always tell me that. "Oh my gosh, I know it's so bad. Every time I meet an entrepreneur, I want to invest in them, but I don't have any more money." So it's like this real, back and forth. So you're trying to like help these people. You're trying to get the message out there, and there was just such a disconnect because these poor entrepreneurs, they're trying so hard to raise money. They're trying so hard to build their company, and it's like having 5 full-time jobs trying to do those 2 things. So I just thought, you know what? Maybe if I try to demystify this, people would be more interested in it. But if I just said to somebody, "Hey, you should read this book about angel investing," they'd be like, "Why would I read a book about angel investing? Like, that's not for me." But if I go back to, how about we just talk about investing for change? How about we talk about trying to do good and do well at the same time? Now I can get people's attention and then explain like what I'm talking about and how much more welcoming, I guess is a good word, how much more welcoming it is now than it was even 5-10 years ago.
Part of that broadening out, even of understanding how you can contribute, how you can make a difference and help these companies strengthen and build a more robust model, is that element of just sitting back and going, we know in our own businesses that as much as sometimes when we're being intellectually lazy, we just think money will solve everything. Oh, if there'd just be a cash injection, it'd all be solved. That's never the answer. There's always so much more to it. And so I think when we pause long enough and just get curious and then stop thinking about it as that disconnected kind of transactional piece of, we invest with our retirement fund and it's just someone else manages it. And instead bring it back to being, it's as basic as another person running their company and what are the challenges they're facing? What could that look like? We also have to remember that we wear different hats in different settings. All of us, even if you're not Bill Gates, we wear a philanthropic hat at some points where we make a donation or a grant somewhere, and then we wear the hat of being a volunteer in other settings. And so it's bringing those same pieces into how we're thinking about investing in other companies that, are there pieces where we are willing to put some money in, and sometimes that vehicle might be patient capital that we're only going to get paid back the actual amount, but over a longer time period. Like starting to be creative and flexible, I think, is a key part once we've gone through that mindset shift you spoke about of like, once we think of ourselves as an investor, It's then just starting to broaden out, what does that even mean to be an investor? I always say to people that, one of the mantras that I use and work with leaders on is to think like a system, act like an entrepreneur. And that relates to how we invest as well, because what I find is when people are able to understand some of those words you just used of like, oh, okay, this is my allocation that is about, it's speculative. If I lose it, that's okay. It's a percentage of my portfolio. This is a different type of investment. When they start to understand the whole, the system, then as you drill down to that act like an entrepreneur, when you drill into how you make decisions, where you're allocating your money. So if we use that same framework, but for investment, what I've also found myself over particularly the last sort of 24 or so years is that when you operate like that, you actually can help address some of those liquidity aspects you just spoke about, because you can say, oh, how could I invest my time and skill set at this phase? How could I put some of what would otherwise be philanthropic money in as patient capital at this stage? I'll put some here in that speculative sense as an angel investor. And actually what I'm doing is using different buckets of my own money to help progress a company so that you can invest in a more straightforward way when they're at a stage of growth and able to take debt, for example? Or how do people even find the opportunity to learn more?
The number one thing is find out what's going on in your own backyard. That was how I learned about it. Somebody invited me to a local meeting. I got to see local entrepreneurs. If there's a university or any kind of college or even close to you, even remotely close, there's likely a lot of innovation happening there. And in a lot of cases, that innovation spins out and tries to get commercialized into a company. And that's really where a lot of startups are born. So usually you tend to see bigger entrepreneurial hubs near big universities, and like Stanford and California is probably the biggest one because that's right there in Silicon Valley. But, Boston has a big one. They've got Harvard, MIT, you could go on and on. But like I said, there's entrepreneurs in every city and every town. So even if somebody just did an online search for startup events or entrepreneurial events and then just fill in your town, they could find a lot of things to do.
Yeah. And in some ways, if you're in a smaller location, it also means that you're not then competing. Like if you're near Stanford or you're near Harvard, there's also a lot more people with a lot more money than you in that same pool. So it's not necessarily a negative thing to be in a smaller location. In fact, you might be able to tap into that community in a much richer way and have the opportunity to engage in a really meaningful sense with those entrepreneurs. So I actually think it can work to your advantage to not be near those big players.
I completely agree.
One of the pieces that you touched on earlier was around the idea of democratizing investment. You've touched on some of the power dynamics and gender issues that are at play there, and your desire to get more women to actually become investors so that we can see some of that shift happen faster, because there's a reflection and an empathy between those pitching for the capital and those with the capital. I had this fascinating experience where we started to run what in the US and now in Australia is called Shark's Tank, but originally was called Dragon's Den in the UK. So we started to run Dragon's Den events to help investors realise they did know the questions to ask, give them that confidence, and they'd sit in the audience, and as they heard someone pitch and thought, oh, I don't know what I think about that number, and then they'd hear one of the dragons ask, unpack those numbers for me. It would kind of give, as you're sitting in the audience, it gives you that confidence. But we then shifted into having these investor dinners. So it was kind of get some confidence and you'd come to the dinner. On this gendered aspect, I was just blown away every time at the way that women, even wealthy, high net worth, ultra high net worth women, had lost that sense of, they had handed over control of their investments to their advisors and to other people. I had situations where I would have women say, could you write me a note to give to my advisor to let me come to the dinner? So there's this power dynamic that can be at play where people really have been told that they don't understand and it's not their domain, like let someone else deal with it. I'm wondering if you can unpack a little bit through a lot of the work you've done around women, investing in women, and women being investors, if there's some things that you've seen that are helpful in that shift, which for some people is a really big mindset shift to even think they're capable of doing this.
You know what? That's literally the $1,000,000 question. It is really hard to crack that. What I have found, and one of the big reasons I wrote the workbook, was the workbook almost takes a step back even before the book, because the book is more like a demystifying. What is all this? What is investing? What would it be like to invest in a private company? How do you do it? Who would do it? Why would you do it? All that kind of stuff. But what I found was I would get mostly women. I would do some webinars, like workshops talking about this. And women would say, oh my gosh, I love this. It's so great. I really want to do it. But then they'd stall because they would still feel like, I'm not sure, I'm not 100% sure how to do this, blah, blah, blah. So what I found is if they could see an entrepreneur, especially female entrepreneur, pitch their company, meaning that they're talking about what their problem is that they're solving, what the solution is that they've come up with, who's their team, and how are they going to get this to market and make money. If they could tell that story and women could watch that, they all of a sudden the light bulb went off. It was like, okay, now I understand what you're talking about. Because in some cases, it's just hard to conceptualize. If somebody's telling you a whole bunch of things about it, but you can't really visualize or think about it, well, how would it work in real life? I could sit here all day and be like, well, there's companies out there that are working on blah, blah, blah. And you're like,
That's a
what
great
are they
idea.
doing?
Yeah,
it's a great idea. What are they doing though? And how exactly are they doing it? But then as soon as you see somebody who's doing it, you think, oh, I kind of watched the light bulb go off as I would show different pitches to people who were interested in investing. And I thought, okay, maybe that's part of the thing. So in the workbook, I actually put pitch decks. I had to retract, dedact a lot of information.
Of course.
But whatever. But the biggest problem that I see entrepreneurs face is they can't explain the problem that they're solving well enough. And if they can do that, and then they can explain why their solution is so great, that's the biggest hurdle they have to get over as an entrepreneur. And so to me, that was a really big point of trying to show these pitch decks in the workbook. So I showed one and I gave my commentary and I would say, hey, here, this is this slide, blah, blah, this is what they're trying to do, blah. And then I gave a second pitch deck, a different company with no commentary. And so people could go through and they could write, well, this is the question I would, if I was looking at this, I would look at it and say, well, this is a question I would have. But then the third set of the deck is that second company, but with my questions. So they could try it. They could watch me do it. They try it and then they watch me, and in a lot of cases, we'd have different questions. And that's one thing that's so great about newer investors is they ask some really amazing questions that even the most seasoned angels and investors would think, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that? Of course, that's a fantastic question. They always think, oh, I don't want to ask a question because, I might look dumb or that's a dumb question, silly question. Meanwhile, there's been times there'd be a new person in the room and they'd ask a question. I'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't even think of that. Duh, to myself, So I think it's just a matter of getting comfortable with the actual process. And as soon as it becomes something that we talk about more, that's the other problem. We don't talk about this enough. You don't hear this talked about at any type. There aren't really clubs there's angel groups around the country, but they're so still small and in their infancy compared to what you see, as far as bigger investment types of things. So.
Yeah, where it's so valuable to have people like yourself sharing, writing your book, putting that out there in the world, because we have partly not been having those conversations because there was a level of exclusivity. Those who were in that camp weren't incentivized to open it up and democratize it because it worked to their favor. And sometimes I've observed that part of why it feels confusing is because often those describing it to you, they have always done it themselves, invested themselves in a disconnected way. It's someone else's money. They're managing the fund or whatever. So they're not actually thinking about it in the same way you are as a direct investor with your money. I can't tell you the amount of tables I've sat at where everyone will be very opinionated about a whole bunch of things. And then when you're cheeky and kind of say, can I just ask who's actually investing their own money in this? They'll be like me and one other person. You go, okay, well, that's a very different conversation that drops it from the hypothetical. And so I think it's exciting to see work like yours. And then for a few years here in Australia, I've been investing with the Flying Fox crew, and they do a lot of education around letting people walk that journey and understand angel investment. So I think there are people doing it, but as you said, you need to get curious and kind of connect in with the right people. Right. I'm guessing you would agree with me that one of the things, though, is to be discerning of like, are you talking with people who are actively practitioners? They're doing it themselves, they're investors. I don't think it's helpful to just keep it all intellectual and academic. But part of that is we have different levers to pull ourselves. We're just not thinking about that systemic level of how we ourselves operate. That mindset piece, I totally agree with you that all of this work starts with just how you're thinking about the issue and what opportunities you have. Are there some elements that you want to kind of point out to us when we think about those different types of investments? You mentioned the risk profile aspect, that it's not liquid, there's the speculative nature. Talk to us a little bit about that importance of diversifying even within your angel investments and what that looks like and how we need to think about that.
Yeah, I actually tell a story in the book about two people that were in my original angel, first angel group I ever joined. And each of them gave money to invest in three different companies, not the same three, but one did three and the other did three. And so the one guy, he ended up having two companies that exited, gave him a really nice return. And the other company was doing fine. And so in the first 2 years, he thought angel investing was the greatest thing that ever happened to him. And the other guy invested in three companies. Two of them went out of business in the first year, and the other one was kind of limping along. So he thinks angel investing is the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life. Neither of them are a good example because that's not really reality. It is true that it's risky and there are a lot of startups that don't make it. So that's why you diversify. Three companies isn't enough. So you really need to put money into more companies. And sometimes that's hard if you're writing individual checks into each company. You don't necessarily have enough money, to keep doing that over and over again. I'm a huge fan of funds and people who invest through a fund manager. And that's what I've done a lot of my investing through is through funds. In some cases, I was the fund manager or I was on the investment committee. In other cases, I was a passive LP. That's another thing I think people don't realize. They think, oh my gosh, if I make this investment, I'm gonna have to follow it, and then I'm gonna have to do all this work afterward to keep up with it. And, and it depends on the investment. You can be as involved or as not involved as you want to. In some cases, I'm lucky if I hear from the entrepreneur once a year with an annual update. Other times I have to be knocking on their door. Hello, do you remember me? Please give me some updates. And then other cases I hear from the entrepreneurs all the time. So, and then there's everything in between. So it's just, I think it's diversifying what you have in your own bucket of alternative investments is really important. And just making sure that you keep that in mind as you're making investments and that you have a plan. That you've decided I'm putting aside this amount of money in this bucket to do this. And once I'm done investing what's in the bucket, I got to wait until I get more liquidity. You can't just keep don't put your kids' college savings into something, especially if they're 18, they're about to go to college next year. Don't use that money. Okay. Don't do it.
Yeah, no, very, very true. Are there any elements that we haven't touched on that for you are really critical for people to hear or understand? It might be about the financial side. It might be more about the emotional rewards that come from this type of work. What do you want to make sure we leave people with?
Well, I definitely think there's a lot of emotional rewards. I don't know that if you were just doing it purely for financial reasons. The statistics over time, if you do diversify, do say that you can get a very nice return. But you also have to think about, are these the things that you care about changing? Do you care about this innovation? Do you care about creating jobs? Do you care about finding, the next company that's really going to make a big effect on the world? Those things really matter to me. And then the other thing that I found that I was just so surprised about, not that I just didn't know, was I met people I would have never met otherwise. So I got to know people in a way that was different than, oh,
Mm.
met you at a party, or, or I met you at a friend's dinner or whatever. You're meeting people and you're working on something together that's really interesting and fascinating. And you're learning about other people's backgrounds because you're learning that they have a level of expertise when they look at a company and you have a level of expertise when you look at it. And when you put it together, it's a really nice combination of being able to decide if this is an investable company or not. You can't make those decisions on your own, or at least you definitely shouldn't try.
Yeah.
So I found that I made a lot of friends that I didn't think I would ever meet, people in every type of industry and every type of job. And I just thought, this is pretty cool. Like, I had no idea you could actually, build your network by investing in early stage companies. So it was pretty cool.
It also has that element, there's a few win-wins that are created in what you've just described. So creating that community addresses one of those aspects that can stop people investing in that, well, if I've only got this amount of money, there's a limit to what I can do. Well, collectively investing that means you can play in a different way, which addresses the lack of liquidity in the market. So you're addressing multiple things at the same time. There's also, though, one of the pieces that you just spoke about. So yes, you'll meet people you wouldn't have otherwise met, and that can have a whole bunch of elements related to expanding your network. I also find that the more that you're in these spaces and you're hearing pitches and you're hearing other people's questions and the challenges in this market over here or this sector, for all of us who are running businesses, I cannot tell you how valuable it is to have your finger on that pulse in a way that if you're just in your industry running your business head down, you're not spotting risk in the same way. You're not seeing opportunities. A whole level of what makes innovation possible and makes us differentiate our own businesses is that it's sort of this, Brad, my partner, always talks about the juxtaposition of two previously unconnected things. Like, that's what innovation is. You go, ooh, I take this bit over here and that bit over there. They both might exist in the world. They're just not connected yet. And I think these conversations, exposure to other, whether it's early stage or growth stage businesses and investors, what it does is just expand what you're exposed to, which will strengthen your own business. So I think there's all of these flow-on effects that are connected to just that initial shift of mindset you spoke about of seeing yourself as an investor. I think that it has the financial bits, it's got those emotional bits, but it also has a direct connection on you will absolutely run your own business better.
Absolutely. In fact, I wish I had known more about angel investing when I was working in corporate America, because I would have approached my job and my role and how I worked with other people differently. Even though I was in a bigger company, I wasn't in a startup. But if you start to have that entrepreneurial mindset, you start to think outside the box a little more.
Yes. And you see what drives customers to stay loyal or to, drive recurring revenue. You just see things in a different way because it's been pointed out to you either by one of those businesses in their pitch or by a question another investor asks. So I think there's so many layers to this, and obviously we could talk all day, but it's been really great to begin to explore what this can look like. And we will share some links in the show notes, but for people listening, where is the best place that you like folks to connect with you to find the book and your other work?
They can just go to my website. It's simply my name, Marcia, Marcia, Dawood, DAWOOD.com. And everything's there, the podcast. I do have playlists now for the podcast because I started to talk to people and I'd be like, oh, if you're interested in using philanthropic dollars to invest in a for-profit company, I have a couple podcast episodes on that. And I would try to tell them what they were. And they were like, what are you talking about? So I started putting them in a playlist. So that's all categorized on the website. And then you can find the book, the workbook. You can actually download chapter 1 and the introduction for free. And I run a lot of promotions on Amazon for the ebook at 99 cents. So if people want to check that out, they can do that too.
Plenty of options there. And I think from what you've described, that practical aspect of people being able to dip their toe in the water, start to intellectually get their head around what it might look like, and then hopefully feel more confident to engage. I hope this has been helpful and that you're beginning to think of yourself as an investor, because I think we would both say you already are. Just
you already are. That's right.
Start to have that mindset shift and be brave, but also diversify. Think about having a portfolio, all of those things. And my hope is that this expands your own networks and contribution to the wonderful work that businesses are doing. But also, as I touched on just in that last part, that it actually helps you think about and run your own business better in the process, because we would both be strong advocates to remind you that you can merge money and meaning, you can do good and make money at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. And this is a really exciting way to do that as business leaders. So thank you so much, Marcia. And thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thanks for having me.